suspended exactly 1 million miles from our fragile planet in the absolute freezing stillness of the second Lagrange point. The James Webb Space Telescope silently pivots its massive array of perfectly polished, gold-plated beryllium mirrors to desperately capture the incredibly faint, ancient infrared echoes emanating from the darkest and most unexplored sectors of the forgotten cosmic dark ages. Deep inside the highly secure Mission Control Center at the Space Telescope Science Institute, completely exhausted, technicians are jolted awake as the state-of-the-art near-infrared camera suddenly transmits a series of terrifyingly intense thermal signatures that utterly defy every established model of astrophysical reality and threaten to completely shatter our fundamental understanding of space. Desperately attempting to rule out an unprecedented hardware malfunction, engineers command the specialized cryocucula system to plunge the delicate instruments down to a brutal 7 Kelvin, aiming to eliminate absolutely any trace of background thermal noise that might be artificially generating this completely monstrous and violently expanding anomaly appearing on their high-resolution monitors. However, as the advanced spectroscopic data finishes rendering through the supercomputers, the horrified scientists realize that this impossible heat signature is entirely authentic, representing an impossibly dense primordial behemoth that is actively devouring the primordial cosmic web with a relentless, unnatural ferocity that should not be mathematically possible in this sector of the universe. Initial readings pulled directly from the mid-infrared instrument reveal a staggering redshift metric hovering around an unprecedented z-value of 16.2, practically proving that this ravenous cosmic cancer cell has existed since the absolute dawn of time and has spent 13 billion years silently accumulating catastrophic mass while hiding perfectly in the cosmic background radiation. The sheer volume of chaotic photons bombarding the telescope's hypersensitive detectors creates a haunting mosaic of jagged light on the laboratory screens, painting a disturbingly vivid picture of countless ancient star systems being brutally stretched, fragmented, and ultimately obliterated by an inescapable gravitational riptide that is operating completely outside the bounds of known physics. Frantic researchers desperately run the incoming gravitational distortion parameters through independent orbital dynamics simulators, only to watch in absolute frozen terror as the sophisticated software repeatedly crashes, because the monstrous anomaly is injecting impossible mathematical variables that fundamentally contradict every single law of general relativity we have ever relied upon for safety. This is not merely a supermassive black hole, passively consuming wandering dust clouds, but rather an aggressive, predatory rupture in the very fabric of space-time that is actively hunting and devouring the foundational energy of the surrounding cosmos, generating a monstrous wake of absolute nothingness that is rapidly destabilizing the gravitational integrity of neighboring galactic superclusters. As the raw telemetry data continuously updates with fresh, nightmarish coordinates from the depths of the void, the lead astrophysicist notices a deeply disturbing pattern in the anomaly's trajectory vectors, realizing with sickening clarity that the destructive shockwave of collapsing physics is not just an isolated cosmic event, but rather a targeted phenomenon moving with horrifying purpose. Staring blankly at the rapidly decaying mathematical models projecting the catastrophic expansion of this ancient terror, the silenced room of world-class scientists collectively realizes the truly ultimate horror of this discovery. If this primordial apex predator is already rewriting the laws of physics across the universe, how much time do we actually have left before it reaches our solar system? As high-powered supercomputers render the initial volumetric simulation of the incoming telemetry, a terrifying three-dimensional model blooms across mission control, revealing a colossal tear in space-time that is expanding at an unnatural velocity, actively shredding surrounding gravitational geometry and transforming ancient star systems into blinding streams of superheated plasma before swallowing them into absolute oblivion. Within the digital rendering, entire cosmic filaments containing hundreds of thousands of newly formed early galaxies are systematically crushed under the weight of an unnatural gravitational surge, while a horrific shockwave of pure physical destruction radiates outward across millions of light years, leaving behind a vast, completely hollow void that has been entirely stripped of all thermodynamic energy, light, and observable matter. The simulated event horizon displays an unprecedented degree of tidal disruption, where space itself is stretched beyond its fundamental tension limit, until the geometry of reality snaps like a physical thread under extreme stress, causing the surrounding vacuum to collapse inward with violent kinetic force that creates massive gravitational tsunamis that destabilize celestial structures and rip newborn stars apart at their cores. Astrophysicists watching the screen in stunned silence observe an accretion disk radiating energy at over 99.9% efficiency, a staggering metric that violates theoretical boundaries of mass energy conversion. While the software algorithms attempting to calculate the energy density of the roaring plasma ring trigger widespread system failures across the facility's high-performance server clusters due to register overflows. Frame by frame, the high-resolution render illustrates the brutal annihilation of ancient globular clusters, where millions of ancient suns are compressed into hyperdense slivers of light before being extinguished forever in the pitch-black abyss, mirroring a localized end-of-days scenario on a macrocosmic scale that proves even the most massive stellar furnaces in existence are utterly helpless against the unbridled fury of this growing anomaly. To the horrified researchers in mission control, the visual imagery resembles a lethal black cancer cell, spreading aggressively across a delicate biological web, consuming healthy surrounding tissue and replacing structured order with absolute chaos, while every simulated tick of cosmic time shows the ravenous shadow consuming thousands of cubic megaparsecs as it absorbs the raw gravitational potential of every galactic structure in its path. As the digital model projects the event into the future, the sheer violence of these physics-breaking shockwaves produces a cascading gravitational rupture that ripples outward through the cosmic web toward neighboring galactic filaments, demonstrating that the collapse of space-time in this primordial epoch is not isolated, but rather generates hypervelocity gravitational waves that permanently alter the physical constants of surrounding space. A heavy, suffocating silence descends upon the room as senior astronomers stare at the monitor, realizing that the predictable universe they studied for decades has been brutally replaced by a savage cosmic battleground, where the mathematical certainty anchoring human physics vanishes in an instant, leaving the team to confront a visceral, primal terror that no amount of academic training could ever prepare them to face. Rerunning the predictive vector analysis with revised spatial expansion parameters, the lead computational astrophysicist watches with growing horror as the computer maps the trajectory of the accelerating gravitational wake across cosmological epochs, showing a relentless path pointing directly through the cosmic web toward our local supercluster, and proving that this destruction is steadily reducing the physical distance to our own Milky Way. If this ancient primordial behemoth has been expanding unchecked at near impossible speeds since the universe was in its earliest infancy, how many billions of light years of structured reality have already been silently devoured in the dark? And what catastrophic fate awaits our fragile planet when the edge of this physics-shattering gravitational front finally reaches the outer boundaries of our unsuspecting solar system? In the crisp mountain air of the 1920s at the Mount Wilson Observatory, astronomer Edwin Hubble peered through the massive Hooker telescope and fundamentally changed our understanding of reality by proving that the universe was steadily expanding in a highly predictable, mathematically elegant manner that brought a profound sense of structured order to the terrifyingly vast and chaotic cosmic darkness. For nearly a century following those groundbreaking observations, the global scientific establishment comfortably relied upon the cosmological principle, universally assuming that matter was distributed evenly throughout a fundamentally uniform cosmos that operated like a perfectly synchronized mechanical clock whose intricate internal gears were governed by absolute, unbreakable, and entirely logical physical laws. The horrifying telemetry currently flooding into modern servers from the James Webb Space Telescope brutally shatters that century-long illusion of cosmic safety, proving unequivocally that the pristine mathematical harmony we once mapped across the celestial sphere was nothing more than a localized, temporary coincidence, masking an ancient, savage reality that is entirely indifferent to our desperate need for order. Generational textbooks continuously taught astrophysics students that deep space expansion was a smooth, isotropic phenomenon spreading gently across the endless void, systematically ignoring deeply unsettling early anomalies and forcing terrifying cosmic irregularities into neat mathematical boxes that artificially maintained the comforting narrative of a completely stable and eternally peaceful cosmological environment. This newly discovered primordial behemoth completely weaponizes the very concept of cosmic expansion, utilizing the underlying fabric of space-time not as a gentle stretching medium, but as a violently destructive accelerant that amplifies its predatory gravitational reach far beyond anything predicted by Hubble's foundational constant or the accepted standard model of a steadily cooling, logically evolving universe. When early cartographers of the cosmos drew their intricate maps of galactic superclusters and determined the absolute age of creation at 13.8 billion years, they suffered from a profound scientific hubris, completely unaware that their carefully constructed timeline was hiding a ravenous shadow that had been actively cannibalizing the foundational architecture of reality since the absolute beginning. In prestigious observatories and university halls worldwide, dusty historical archives containing the most revered cosmological papers of the 20th century are essentially rendered obsolete overnight, as the sheer aggressive scale of this impossibly ancient spatial rupture fundamentally contradicts the peaceful evolutionary models that generations of brilliant astronomers literally dedicated their entire lives to build. The terrifying paradigm shift, forcing humanity to abandon its cherished historical models, reveals that our beloved universe is not a grand mathematically elegant symphony of perfectly orbiting spheres, but rather a brutally violent and utterly chaotic slaughterhouse, where apex gravitational predators ruthlessly consume structured matter while deliberately rewriting the fundamental rules of physical engagement in the dark. Decades of intellectual comfort, rooted in the reassuring equations of classical cosmology, are rapidly dissolving into absolute existential panic, as researchers desperately scrub through decades of old terrestrial radio telescope data, only to horrifically realize that the faint, unexplained background static they historically dismissed as mere instrumental noise was actually the distant, echoing roar of this cosmic monster. If our most brilliant historical minds were completely blind to an ancient phenomenon that operates entirely outside the boundaries of established cosmological science, what other apocalyptic horrors are currently lurking undetected in the expanding cosmic darkness? And how can humanity possibly hope to survive an encroaching cataclysm when the very historical physics we rely upon to defend ourselves have just been erased? As the absolutely terrifying reality of this unprecedented primordial cosmic predator finally settles over the entire global scientific community, a profound and deeply unsettling sense of philosophical isolation begins to completely overshadow the initial shock of the terrifying mathematical impossibilities currently streaming into the hopelessly overwhelmed and deafeningly silent mission control room. For generations, humanity desperately clung to the comforting illusion that the universe was merely a sterile, predictable clockwork machine, waiting patiently to be entirely decoded by our brilliant minds and advanced orbital instruments, completely ignoring the deeply terrifying possibility that the endless cosmic dark might actually harbor predatory entities possessing unimaginable destructive scale. This apocalyptic revelation brutally strips away the protective psychological barrier of human exceptionalism, forcing astronomers to confront the sickening truth that our existence on a microscopic blue speck is utterly meaningless to an expanding void that actively weaponizes the very fabrics of space-time to deliberately consume structured matter and entirely erase the faint light of early creation. The suffocating weight of this unprecedented cosmic loneliness physically presses down on the researchers as they realize that the billions of galaxies surrounding us are not majestic realms waiting for future human exploration, but rather a vast, silent graveyard of fundamentally doomed star systems, awaiting their inevitable execution at the hands of a ravenous, physics-breaking cosmological anomaly. Staring blankly at the rapidly updating telemetry screens, mapping the absolute destruction of ancient superclusters, scientists experience a collective existential crisis as the trusted mathematical foundations of our entire reality crumble into meaningless dust under the oppressive gravitational footprint of a terrifyingly ancient shadow that operates with a brutal and entirely unfathomable cosmic will. The desperate human desire to find some underlying cosmic meaning or logical purpose within the grand architecture of reality is instantly crushed by the raw, unfeeling violence of this impossibly old phenomenon, permanently replacing our hopeful celestial wonder with a primal, paralyzing dread that leaves the greatest minds on the planet feeling like helpless insects anticipating a descending boot. Every philosophical framework painstakingly constructed throughout thousands of years of human intellectual evolution suddenly feels completely pathetic and tragically naive when forcefully juxtaposed against the aggressively expanding cosmic nothingness that has spent the last 13 billion years quietly preparing to aggressively swallow the entire observable universe into an inescapable cold darkness. This profound realization that the cosmos is actively hostile and fundamentally incompatible with the continued existence of ordered biological life transforms the James Webb Space Telescope from a magnificent instrument of glorious scientific discovery into a tragic, horrifying mirror reflecting our own rapidly approaching, entirely mathematically inescapable, and utterly absolute existential annihilation. As the deeply disturbing implications of this broken reality ripple outward from the astronomical community to the broader philosophical world, humanity is violently awakened from its blissful ignorance, finally understanding that our temporary survival was merely a fleeting, accidental cosmic oversight rather than any sort of destined, permanent triumph over the chaotic forces of the ancient universe. If our cherished existence is truly nothing more than a momentary mathematical glitch, patiently waiting to be forcefully corrected by an apocalyptic cosmic predator that fundamentally defies human comprehension, how can our civilization possibly maintain its sanity as we helplessly watch the absolute laws of physics begin to permanently unravel right before our desperately terrified, unblinking eyes? Deep within the heavily fortified Mission Control Center, panicked technicians violently force the highly sensitive mid-infrared instrument to execute an unprecedented emergency recalibration sequence, specifically engineered to meticulously measure the entirely impossible thermal emissions currently radiating outward from the ancient anomalies aggressively expanding and hyperluminous chaotic accretion disk. As the incredibly complex cryptographic algorithms desperately attempt to process the raw photonic data continuously streaming back from the Lagrange point, the resulting mathematical models immediately and brutally contradict every single foundational principle of classical general relativity that theoretical physicists have unconditionally trusted and rigorously verified for well over a century of human science. The terrifying telemetry actively confirms that the fundamental mechanism of universal gravity is fundamentally breaking down within the dark distortion field, effectively inverting the precise mathematical equations that Albert Einstein famously utilized to beautifully bind the structural geometry of our known physical reality together into a cohesive and predictable cosmological framework for future generations. Instead of gracefully curving the localized space-time fabric to create predictable gravitational wells, this ravenous primordial predator is actively generating an inverted spatial geometry that forcefully and mathematically repels surrounding local dark matter, while simultaneously consuming its raw thermodynamic energy from the inside out in a catastrophic process completely unrecognized by the modern astrophysics community. Massive supercomputer server clusters begin to literally overheat and loudly trigger physical hardware alarms, as the continuous influx of completely paradoxical coordinate geometry forces the sophisticated calculation matrix into infinite recursive loops, definitively proving that terrestrial human mathematics simply cannot accurately describe the apocalyptic nature of this rapidly expanding cosmological anomaly. Highly classified readings published instantly to the secured internal network desperately reveal an unprecedented 99.7% signal anomaly rate, where the universally accepted gravitational constant is violently fluctuating by staggering orders of magnitude, a horrifying reality that is effectively and permanently rewriting the baseline physics of the universe with every passing millisecond. The beautifully elegant tensor calculus that historically allowed humanity to successfully launch satellites, confidently map the stars, and fully understand the cosmos is abruptly rendered entirely useless as the black hole's wake forcefully replaces structured reality with a highly chaotic and entirely hostile quantum foam that completely defies all logical observational parameters we have ever established. Exhausted researchers frantically realize that this terrifying entity is not simply bending the ancient light of distant galaxies, but it is actually deliberately executing a localized deletion of the fundamental Higgs field, functionally removing physical mass from the early universe and aggressively transforming incredibly dense stars into completely scattered, weightless radiation in an instant of sheer violence. As the core architectural scaffolding of theoretical physics violently collapses under the sheer impossible mass of this primordial titan, the very concept of relativistic time dilation suddenly becomes a lethal cosmic weapon, literally freezing dying ancient star clusters in a permanent and highly visible state of agonizing structural disintegration for tens of billions of years in the freezing absolute darkness. If the supposedly unbreakable equations of general relativity are genuinely proven to be entirely meaningless against the rapidly approaching wrath of this ancient cosmic abomination, what terrifyingly alien and utterly invisible physical forces will ultimately govern our dying solar system when the unyielding gravitational shockwave finally shatters the fragile borders of our completely defenseless home galaxy? In the highly transformative academic year of 1915, the brilliant visionary Albert Einstein fundamentally revolutionized humanity's understanding of the surrounding cosmos by boldly publishing his incredibly elegant theory of general relativity, permanently cementing a profoundly comforting psychological anchor that our desperate civilization would unconditionally rely upon for well over an entire century of scientific exploration. For countless generations, spanning across prestigious global universities, elite theoretical astrophysicists universally treated these beautifully balanced gravitational equations as absolute religious dogma, completely refusing to entertain any horrifying notion that our fundamental mathematical understanding of reality might simply be a temporary illusion, masking a much darker cosmic truth hidden in the endless expanding void. The historical scientific establishment arrogantly believed that by meticulously mapping the delicate curvature of localized space-time fabric around massive stellar bodies, they had somehow permanently conquered the terrifying chaos of the ancient universe and successfully reduced the infinite, sprawling darkness into a perfectly safe, logically predictable mechanical clockwork that entirely submitted to terrestrial human mathematics. However, the completely unprecedented anomalous thermal readings currently devastating the secure servers at the Space Telescope Science Institute are brutally obliterating that cherished century of academic hubris, actively proving that Einstein's deeply beloved formulas were merely localized atmospheric conditions that simply do not apply to the aggressive, primordial nightmares lurking just beyond our limited observational horizon. As the terrifying gravitational distortion values spike to completely impossible metrics exceeding 99% signal anomaly thresholds, the collective global scientific community is violently forced to endure a deeply traumatizing intellectual collapse, helplessly watching their only trusted mathematical safety nets instantly evaporate into absolute nothingness under the crushing weight of an ancient cosmological predator. This devastating paradigm shift perfectly mirrors the historical existential panic that forcefully gripped medieval astronomers when they first horrifically realized the Earth was not the center of creation, though this modern cosmic betrayal is infinitely worse, because it aggressively permanently steals the very underlying structural logic that prevents our fragile human minds from completely fracturing into utter chaotic madness. Archival recordings of proud 20th century physicists confidently lecturing about the unbreakable speed of light and the absolute conservation of cosmic energy now sound like the tragic, desperately naive whispers of doomed children playing safely within a tiny, fragile sandbox, while a highly aggressive and completely unstoppable natural disaster silently approaches from the freezing shadows of the ancient background radiation. The deeply unsettling reality is that every single beautifully constructed equation our historical ancestors meticulously carved into chalkboards to proudly explain the fundamental nature of gravity was actually just a completely pathetic illusion, heavily masking a violently unstable cosmological architecture that was explicitly designed to be completely consumed by these utterly incomprehensible, primordial gravitational leviathans. Stripped entirely of our most sacred mathematical anchors and brutally abandoned by the historical scientific icons we worshipped for over 100 years, modern humanity is left drifting entirely alone through an actively hostile cosmic slaughterhouse, desperately clinging to broken scientific instruments that can only blindly record the horrifying and mathematically undeniable approach of our complete and total physical erasure. If the foundational equations that definitively built our modern technological civilization were actually completely fundamentally flawed from the very absolute beginning, then what unimaginably terrifying and completely undetected cosmic horrors are currently slipping through the massive, gaping holes in our completely shattered physical reality as the unyielding darkness rapidly accelerates toward our defenseless home star system. As the catastrophic collapse of foundational physical laws forcefully cascades across the entire observable universe, highly advanced supercomputers at the agency actively project an absolutely nightmarish visualization where the incredibly delicate interwoven fabric of space-time is currently being violently ripped apart by a completely unstoppable primordial force operating with pure, terrifying cosmic malice. Without any underlying geometric structure remaining to physically anchor the newly shattered cosmic void, wildly unpredictable and deeply violent gravitational tsunamis are suddenly unleashed across the absolute darkness, silently roaring through the expanding universe at unprecedented hypervelocities that actively and mercilessly obliterate nearby newborn star-forming regions with absolute impunity. Every single frame of the terrifying simulation vividly illustrates how these physics-breaking shockwaves aggressively distort the passing light of ancient quasars into grotesque, unnatural shapes, proving that the very dimension of distance is being systematically deleted from the universal architecture as the anomaly forcefully crushes millions of light-years into razor-thin bands of pure energy. In a completely horrifying subversion of traditional thermodynamic laws, the incredibly dense gravitational shockwave effectively operates as a localized cosmic eraser that rapidly absorbs all structural entropy, instantly reducing massive galactic superclusters into an unrecognizable quantum slush that mathematically violates the sacred principle of mass conservation established during our intellectual history. The sheer, unadulterated violence of this ongoing cosmological event strongly suggests a rapidly accelerating and completely uncontainable catastrophic cascade failure of reality itself, where each newly destroyed galaxy exponentially adds to the anomaly's terrifying momentum and permanently destabilizes the extremely fragile gravitational boundaries of adjacent celestial neighborhoods across the void. Like an aggressively expanding stress fracture, actively traveling across an incredibly brittle plane of frozen ice, these catastrophic physics-breaking shockwaves do not just peacefully dissipate into the background vacuum, but actually multiply in raw destructive intensity, creating an unstoppable domino effect that forcefully guarantees the absolute annihilation of any structured matter in its path. Entire solar systems that managed to survive the brutal primordial epochs are now being completely liquefied in mere milliseconds, their brilliant nuclear furnaces violently snuffed out and heavily suppressed by an overwhelming darkness that acts less like a simple physical phenomena and far more like a highly intelligent, actively malevolent infection, deliberately spreading across the cosmic web. Horrifyingly, the updated trajectory vectors, carefully mapped by terrified astrophysics teams, directly indicate that this ever-expanding wave of absolute geometric destruction is not confined to the distant early universe, but is rather steadily marching across the cosmic timeline with an unwavering and utterly terrifying precision aimed directly toward the specific coordinates of our home galaxy. The deeply terrifying mathematical models now conclusively prove that as this apocalyptic cascade continues to forcefully ripple toward our extremely vulnerable local supercluster, it will inevitably shatter the delicate gravitational balance holding the Milky Way together, ensuring that our entire solar system will eventually be aggressively ripped apart by the very fabric of space we once completely trusted. As the brilliant scientists helplessly stare at the highly unstoppable gravitational tsunami steadily rushing toward our fragile sector of the universe, a deeply paralyzing dread fills the room when they realize the most important question is no longer if this physics-shattering apocalypse will permanently erase humanity from existence, but rather exactly how many days of unbroken reality we actually have left. The profound and sudden realization that human civilization has spent thousands of years meticulously building an intricate fortress of scientific understanding upon a fundamentally unstable foundation of localized cosmic illusions, strikes the global academic community with an absolutely paralyzing and completely inescapable wave of pure existential terror that permanently shatters our collective psyche. For centuries, our absolute brightest intellectual luminaries proudly operated within an incredibly tiny and entirely protected microscopic cosmological sandbox, arrogantly assuming that the deeply comforting physical constants neatly observed in our immediate galactic neighborhood universally applied to the infinite, aggressively expanding primordial darkness lurking far beyond our limited optical reach. We are now brutally forced to violently confront the horrifying truth that our seemingly perfect mathematical understanding of reality was nothing more than a highly temporary and extremely localized dimensional anomaly, miraculously sheltering our fragile blue planet from a fundamentally hostile universe that actively seeks to aggressively extinguish the very concept of structured biological existence. Every magnificent technological achievement and monumental philosophical revelation meticulously recorded throughout the entirety of human history is abruptly rendered completely pathetic and utterly meaningless when directly compared against the sheer, incomprehensible scale of this ravenous primordial behemoth that is actively devouring the ancient structural foundations of our doomed cosmic neighborhood. The suffocating blanket of absolute cosmic loneliness violently descends upon terrified researchers in darkened control rooms worldwide as they helplessly watch their sacred astrophysical models crumble into completely useless digital dust, proving that humanity is entirely alone and violently exposed in a predatory cosmological slaughterhouse that actively mocks our desperate, pathetic need for order. Recent philosophical debates rapidly circulating through highly secure and heavily encrypted channels at the National Science Foundation suggest with 99.9% certainty that the fundamental parameters of organic life were simply a mathematical rounding error, that this rapidly encroaching cosmic anomaly is currently attempting to systematically and permanently erase from the timeline. Stripped entirely of the psychological comfort historically provided by the elegant predictability of classical thermodynamics, the greatest analytical minds on Earth are rapidly descending into a state of profound nihilistic despair, completely paralyzed by the terrifying knowledge that reality itself is actively rejecting the sacred mathematical laws that once kept our terrible existential dread safely contained. This impossibly ancient and highly aggressive cosmological phenomenon acts as the ultimate philosophical mirror, forcefully held up to our deeply arrogant civilization, violently reflecting our own profound cosmic vulnerability, and explicitly demonstrating that our cherished intelligence is absolutely powerless to stop the fundamental architecture of the universe from being ruthlessly systematically disassembled. As the horrifying reality that our entire existence is merely a fleeting cosmic accident finally takes root in the global consciousness, a terrifying planetary silence takes hold, completely replacing our historical celestial wonder with a grim, suffocating anticipation of the exact moment when this physics-shattering gravitational shockwave forcefully annihilates the very concept of human historical memory. If our deeply beloved philosophical frameworks and mathematically perfect physical laws were simply a highly fragile optical illusion, masking a universe built exclusively for complete structural consumption, what utterly horrific secrets will the James Webb Space Telescope uncover when it forces its hypersensitive spectroscopic instruments to stare directly into the very deepest core of this expanding abyss? Deep inside the heavily shielded Data Processing Center at the Space Telescope Science Institute, completely exhausted operators initiate an incredibly complex and demanding spectroscopic analysis, utilizing the James Webb Space Telescope's highly sensitive near-infrared spectrograph in a desperate attempt to mechanically dissect the completely chaotic light actively bleeding from the rapidly expanding anomaly. As the initial massive wave of newly processed spectral telemetry violently floods across the ultra-high-definition laboratory monitors, senior astrophysicists are instantly paralyzed by a completely staggering and mathematically impossible redshift metric, definitively confirming a catastrophe of precisely 16.2 that explicitly proves this monster was born in the primordial dark. This terrifyingly extreme cosmological redshift definitively places the birth of this ravenous entity deep within the absolute freezing darkness of the cosmic dawn, a universally dead epoch located over 13.5 billion years in our past, when the infant universe was supposedly entirely devoid of any structured matter or early starlight capable of birthing such a colossal gravitational titan. By meticulously examining the deeply fractured incoming photon streams, terrified researchers successfully isolate highly corrupted absorption lines within the infrared spectrum that mathematically should never exist, painting a highly disturbing microscopic picture of entirely missing elementary particles that heavily suggests the anomaly is aggressively consuming and permanently destroying foundational atomic structures. Secondary diagnostic packages continuously routed through the mid-infrared spectrum simultaneously detect an impossible thermodynamic paradox where the violently spinning accretion disk registers internal plasma temperatures exceeding 50 million degrees, while its outer jagged edges bizarrely remain perfectly submerged in an absolute zero vacuum that fundamentally violates basic thermal radiation laws. The completely raw wavelength data, heavily pouring directly out of the primary sensory arrays, graphically depicts this ancient cosmological aberration, functioning exactly like a monstrous cosmic cancer cell, systematically weaponizing the fundamental properties of light itself to rapidly blind surrounding celestial regions, by actively absorbing all outgoing electromagnetic radiation into its pitch-black core. High-performance computational clusters at the main laboratory are being pushed far beyond their absolute maximum operational thresholds just to render the incredibly dense spectral architecture of this expanding nightmare, resulting in severely localized server crashes as the terrifying mathematical reality of the entity's infinitely compounding mass violently forces the processing matrix into endless recursive loops. A deeper microscopic analysis of the completely shattered infrared emission signatures absolutely confirms the worst possible fear that this ravenous behemoth is not merely eating traditional baryonic gas clouds, but rather it is aggressively metabolizing the invisible dark matter scaffolding that physically holds the entire universe together in a terrifying display of completely unrestrained cosmic gluttony. Every newly captured spectroscopic frame, meticulously evaluated by the horrified scientific team, conclusively demonstrates an exponentially accelerating and completely irreversible rate of spatial decay, heavily radiating outward from the anomaly's center, mathematically guaranteeing that the fundamental properties of the surrounding vacuum are being permanently rewritten into a highly hostile and lethal configuration. As the deeply traumatized technicians helplessly watch the continuous stream of highly corrupted spectroscopic data definitively map the entity's relentless acceleration vector straight toward our localized cosmic neighborhood, a terrifying realization emerges. If this ancient monster is actively deleting the physical building blocks of reality, what will actually happen to the Earth when it finally arrives? As the catastrophic spectroscopic data continues to stubbornly display mathematically impossible thermodynamic anomalies across the monitors, terrified astronomers are violently forced to finally confront the deeply horrifying ultimate resolution to the infamous Fermi Paradox that has haunted our fragile technological civilization since we first desperately began searching the cosmos for radio signals. For decades, we vainly pointed our radio dishes toward the endless sea of stars, praying for a comforting whisper from an advanced extraterrestrial neighbor, entirely oblivious to the sickening reality that this absolute silence is not a mere statistical coincidence, but the direct result of a violently aggressive cosmic predator actively erasing all biological potential from the expanding universal timeline. The deeply suffocating weight of this unprecedented cosmic loneliness physically crushes the exhausted researchers who now understand that humanity's greatest scientific triumphs are ultimately meaningless in a structurally doomed universe, specifically designed to be mercilessly harvested by an impossibly ancient gravitational leviathan, functioning as the final and entirely inescapable evolutionary filter. Staring blankly at the cold numbers cascading down the glowing screens, the world's most brilliant astrophysical minds experience a profoundly traumatizing intellectual collapse as the raw telemetry definitively proves that the fundamental building blocks of our reality are simply temporary energetic fuel completely destined for absolute consumption by this ravenous and infinitely expanding primordial abyss. Instead of a beautifully complex cosmic garden waiting to be peacefully explored by future generations of interstellar human pioneers, the James Webb Space Telescope has brutally revealed that the surrounding billions of galaxies are actually just a vast and entirely silent graveyard filled with the fading echoes of countless doomed worlds that were systematically annihilated in the freezing dark space. The deeply terrifying philosophical implications heavily radiating from this shattered astronomical data loudly suggest that all organic biological life is nothing more than a momentary mathematical glitch, a highly fragile and completely unprotected localized anomaly patiently waiting to be forcefully corrected by an apocalyptic cosmological phenomenon that utterly defies any logical human comprehension. Every single desperately hopeful theory regarding a populated universe brimming with thriving alien civilizations instantly evaporates into absolute nothingness when directly compared against the sheer and unadulterated cosmic malice of a physics-breaking entity that deliberately utilizes the fundamental fabric of space-time itself to relentlessly hunt and devour complex matter across the endless universal void. This horrifying paradigm shift perfectly explains why the ancient skies remain so completely devoid of any detectable alien megastructures or advanced communicative signals, as any extraterrestrial species smart enough to successfully conquer their own home star system would inevitably detect this rapidly approaching gravitational nightmare and ultimately realize the absolute futility of attempting survival. As the catastrophic data definitively maps the relentless and entirely unstoppable trajectory of this primordial predator marching aggressively toward our entirely defenseless local supercluster, humanity is violently stripped of its most sacred philosophical anchor and left drifting completely alone in an actively hostile cosmic slaughterhouse that actively mocks our pathetic psychological need for meaning. If the utterly deafening silence of the terrifyingly vast cosmos is fundamentally maintained by this impossibly ancient entity actively hunting intelligent life in the freezing dark, what entirely apocalyptic horrors will be forcefully unleashed upon our fragile solar system when scientists begin carefully reviewing the historical cosmic microwave background radiation maps to uncover its hidden origins. In the mid-20th century, pioneering radio astronomers utilizing heavily modified microwave receivers accidentally discovered the faintly echoing static of the cosmic microwave background radiation, a monumental scientific breakthrough that fundamentally convinced an arrogant humanity that we had finally captured the fading thermal afterglow of the Big Bang and perfectly mapped the absolute beginning of physical reality. For several decades following that historic discovery, highly advanced orbital observatories, like the Wilkinson Microwave Anisotropy Probe and the Planck spacecraft, meticulously mapped these ancient microscopic temperature fluctuations, proudly presenting the global scientific community with a beautifully detailed and mathematically consistent baby picture of our slowly cooling cosmos, spanning billions of evolutionary years. This painstakingly constructed historical map of the early universe miraculously provided theoretical physicists with a profound sense of psychological security, allowing them to arrogantly dictate the exact timeline of cosmological evolution from the initial rapid inflationary period straight through to the inevitable formation of the very first magnificent celestial superclusters shining brightly within the freezing void. However, the unprecedentedly sharp spectroscopic readings now violently pouring out from the James Webb Space Telescope completely shatter those cherished vintage maps forever, brutally revealing that the seemingly random cold spots historically scattered across the cosmic microwave background were never just harmless thermal variations, but rather the heavily cloaked, terrifying shadows of a rapidly growing primordial monster. By aggressively re-evaluating the archaic microwave telemetry through the highly advanced analytical lens of this newly discovered physics-breaking anomaly, deeply stunned cosmologists realized that their foundational timeline of creation deliberately ignored massive, glaring patches of permanently missing cosmic energy that had been quietly swallowed whole before the very first generation of stars even had a chance to ignite. The incredibly ancient cosmic background radiation was not smoothly cooling down in a perfectly uniform and predictable manner, but was actually being actively disturbed and viciously churned by the sheer gravitational wake of an absolutely terrifying entity that aggressively camouflaged its endless cosmic slaughter completely behind the blindingly bright electromagnetic curtain of the newborn universe's earliest expansion. Every revered astrophysical textbook chapter beautifully detailing the elegant evolution of cosmic structures must now be forcefully ripped out and entirely rewritten to explicitly include this ravenous cosmological apex predator that silently existed long before the formation of standard baryonic matter, feeding endlessly upon the absolute raw thermodynamic potential of a universe that was completely doomed from the start. This devastating historical revelation firmly proves that our human scientists were absolutely never the objective observers of a beautifully functioning cosmic machine, but rather deeply tragic victims of a profound optical illusion completely engineered by the terrifyingly vast physical distances of deep space to successfully hide an encroaching apocalypse that has been ruthlessly hunting us for billions of evolutionary years. As terrified researchers desperately overlay the highly corrupted new wavelength data directly onto the beloved historical maps of the microwave background, they watch in absolute frozen horror as the dark, anomalous cold spots perfectly align to clearly form a massive, continuous trajectory vector that aggressively stretches across the entire observable cosmos and points violently toward our highly fragile Milky Way galaxy. If this impossibly ancient entity has been silently utilizing the fundamental background radiation of the universe to perfectly mask its relentless, violent advance across billions of light years of space, what entirely unimaginable visual horrors will the agency's scientific simulation supercomputers finally reveal when they definitively translate these raw, anomalous spectral frequencies into a terrifying, apocalyptic visual model? Deep within the heavily fortified computational nexus at the Space Telescope Science Institute, utterly terrified technicians forcefully initiate an unprecedented visual translation protocol that aggressively converts the completely corrupted microwave and spectroscopic anomalies into a remarkably vivid, highly detailed, three-dimensional apocalyptic simulation of the incredibly fragile primordial cosmos. The newly rendered digital model graphically displays a violently expanding dark front that operates with the sheer terrifying efficiency of an unstoppable cosmological tsunami, methodically sweeping across billions of cubic light-years and instantaneously extinguishing the brilliant thermonuclear glow of the universe's most ancient and majestic newborn galaxy clusters with absolute and total malice. Completely horrified astronomers watch in paralyzed silence as the relentless simulation painstakingly illustrates the absolute destruction of baryonic matter, where colossal hydrogen clouds and hypermassive primordial stars are aggressively shredded into subatomic ribbons before being forcefully dragged into an impossibly dense, fundamentally lightless gravitational abyss that actively devours the geometry of space. Trailing directly behind the actively feeding event horizon is a profoundly unnatural and utterly terrifying cosmic wasteland, a permanently frozen graveyard where the fundamental kinetic energy required to miraculously sustain physical reality has been completely and violently eradicated by the relentless passing of this ancient, aggressively consuming behemoth that recognizes absolutely no physical boundaries. Within this brutally conquered and completely hollowed-out sector of the early universe, the foundational quantum fields that typically govern basic atomic interactions have been aggressively flattened into an unrecognizable stasis, heavily ensuring that absolutely no new celestial bodies will ever organically form within this endlessly expanding, pitch-black tomb of completely shattered cosmic history. The rapidly evolving and highly complex digital simulation violently demonstrates that this predatory gravitational front is permanently erasing cosmic history at a truly staggering hypervelocity, fundamentally reducing once thriving celestial ecosystems into completely barren, mathematically impossible voids that violently contradict every single established paradigm regarding the natural conservation of cosmic energy. Each simulated passing epoch visually presented on the high-definition displays further magnifies the sheer apocalyptic scale of this localized extinction event, forcefully gripping the helpless researchers with a deeply visceral, primal fear as they witness the terrifying ease with which a thriving and beautifully intricate cosmological neighborhood is brutally transformed into a permanent, icy nothingness. The advanced rendering algorithms desperately attempt to mathematically locate even a single surviving photon or microscopic trace of escaping radiation within the anomaly's catastrophic wake. But the completely unyielding calculations consistently return absolute zero values, definitively proving that this ancient monster leaves absolutely nothing behind for the surrounding universe to miraculously rebuild upon. By explicitly mapping the outer boundaries of this completely dead wasteland against the known coordinates of our modern cosmic web, the horrified simulation engineers realize that this rapidly expanding zone of absolute cosmological erasure is actively carving a highly direct, mathematically undeniable path straight through the ancient darkness and heading violently toward our entirely oblivious Milky Way galaxy. As the catastrophic visual model finally updates to seamlessly display the terrifying entity's deeply unsettling current position within the universe, a paralyzing dread fully takes over the silent control room, because the most critical question remains entirely unanswered. If this expanding dark front is actively destroying the cosmos, how can mainstream astrophysicists possibly attempt to mathematically explain it? Desperately attempting to mathematically salvage the completely shattered foundational framework of classical modern physics from absolute cosmic ruin, elite mainstream astrophysicists heavily utilize the James Webb Space Telescope's incredibly precise near-infrared spectrograph to urgently propose the deeply controversial existence of hypermassive primordial black hole stars lurking inside the void. These highly desperate theoretical researchers rigorously analyze the completely chaotic thermal signatures violently radiating from the anomaly and continuously attempt to forcefully shove this unimaginable cosmic nightmare completely back into a deeply comfortable, scientifically accepted box by mathematically modeling it as a supermassive stellar envelope actively collapsing around a singularity core. By explicitly utilizing the advanced cryogenic capabilities of the mid-infrared instrument to effectively isolate the surrounding thermodynamic output, NASA supercomputers aggressively compare these terrifying new spectral emission lines directly against widely established cosmological models of ultraluminous quasars operating at an extremely high redshift metric previously recorded around Z equals 7. The resulting frantic mathematical gymnastics performed by the terrified scientific community represent a deeply pathetic, fiercely psychological defense mechanism designed exclusively to artificially preserve Albert Einstein's highly revered century-old legacy from being permanently erased by an entity that entirely defies absolutely every single standardized equation regulating massive celestial bodies. However, the raw telemetry data continuously cascading across the encrypted laboratory monitors completely rejects this beautifully constructed mainstream hypothesis, brutally demonstrating that the anomaly's localized energy density output violently exceeds the absolute maximum theoretical Eddington limit for any naturally occurring supermassive stellar object by an entirely impossible factor of 10,000. Furthermore, the high-resolution photometric surveys meticulously conducted by the near-infrared camera completely fail to detect any of the massive baryonic hydrogen gas clouds that are mathematically required to actively fuel such a colossal, theoretically predicted dark star, proving that this ravenous cosmic predator is operating upon a fundamentally alien, highly destructive thermodynamic mechanism. As the desperate mainstream attempts to neatly categorize the aggressively expanding gravitational void, rapidly disintegrate under the crushing weight of absolutely undeniable empirical evidence, the deeply traumatized astronomers realize they can no longer successfully hide behind the reassuring historical safety of standard theoretical astrophysics to explain away this violently encroaching apocalypse. The incredibly detailed structural analysis of the corrupted surrounding spacetime geometry heavily dictates that this apocalyptic phenomenon is absolutely not a dying hypermassive star desperately attempting to consume itself, but rather a completely unnatural and violently aggressive cosmological weapon deliberately designed to systematically hunt and relentlessly obliterate the fabric of our universe. With their heavily preferred, mathematically comforting black hole star hypothesis now lying completely in absolute ruins across the digital laboratory floor, the thoroughly exhausted and deeply terrified scientific establishment is violently forced to finally look beyond the universally accepted boundaries of standard celestial mechanics and begrudgingly entertain far more radical apocalyptic theories. If this entirely mathematically impossible cosmic abomination is definitively proven to not be constructed from standard baryonic matter, what unimaginable apocalyptic horrors will be brutally unleashed when a radical competing scientific faction suddenly suggests that the entity is actively weaponizing and completely detonating the invisible dark matter scaffolding holding our entire home galaxy together. As mainstream scientific consensus completely collapses, a deeply terrifying and highly controversial faction of modern theoretical physicists has desperately proposed an utterly apocalyptic alternative hypothesis, suggesting that this monstrous cosmic anomaly is actively weaponizing and completely detonating the invisible dark matter scaffolding that fundamentally holds our entire expanding universe firmly together in the dark. Instead of merely consuming standard baryonic hydrogen gas clouds, this rapidly expanding gravitational nightmare is fundamentally acting as a catastrophic universal ignition source that deliberately transforms the massive and completely unseen dark matter filaments intricately connecting distant galactic superclusters into a highly volatile, explosively reactive, and fundamentally unstoppable primordial cosmological fuel source. Highly advanced astrophysical supercomputer simulations operating at absolute maximum processing capacity violently illustrate a completely horrifying cosmological chain reaction where the incredibly dense structural foundation of deep space is continuously being forcefully ignited and ruthlessly consumed from the absolute outside edges of the fragile cosmic web, violently inward toward our highly vulnerable galactic neighborhood. As these utterly massive and entirely invisible dark matter halos violently annihilate themselves under the unimaginably crushing physical influence of the approaching anomaly, the highly delicate gravitational glue actively securing countless billions of ancient star systems is instantaneously evaporated into completely useless and heavily scattered, chaotic background radiation floating through the absolute freezing cosmic darkness. Without this fundamentally crucial underlying structural framework, holding their massive borders intact, entire primordial galaxies immediately lose their cohesive orbital rotation and violently spin themselves completely apart, forcefully flinging countless trillions of terrified stellar bodies out into an entirely dead and highly freezing cosmic void that has been entirely stripped of all remaining thermodynamic energy potential. This completely unprecedented and deeply apocalyptic dark matter fire does not behave like any traditional thermodynamic energy we understand, but rather it aggressively cascades through the interwoven cosmic filaments, exactly like a highly intelligent and purely malevolent viral infection deliberately designed by an unknown entity to completely systematically eradicate the structural integrity of the entire observable universe. Because this absolutely catastrophic structural destruction is fundamentally occurring completely within the entirely invisible dark matter spectrum, deeply traumatized human astronomers can only helplessly watch the horrifying secondary physical effects as massive and historically stable visible galaxies simply dissolve into completely meaningless subatomic dust right before their highly sophisticated but utterly useless telescopes. The deeply terrifying and rigorously verified mathematical models generated by desperate researchers now definitively track this completely unstoppable chain reaction of dark matter annihilation rapidly accelerating across the vast cosmic void and currently making absolutely direct, highly violent physical contact with the extreme outer gravitational edges of our enormously expansive but structurally fragile Virgo supercluster. When this incredibly ravenous and fundamentally invisible primordial fire finally reaches the Milky Way's highly concentrated dark matter halo, our own cherished home galaxy will instantly suffer the exact same catastrophic structural unbinding, violently ripping our completely defenseless sun directly away from its surrounding fragile planets in an absolute blinding instant of sheer and unparalleled cosmological physical violence. If the very invisible dark matter scaffolding that originally allowed our fragile universe to successfully form is actually just secretly explosive primordial fuel, patiently waiting to be ruthlessly ignited, how will the terrified scientific establishment desperately react when they suddenly discover that brilliant historical minds entirely rejected and aggressively mocked the early warnings, predicting this exact apocalyptic scenario? In the deeply transformative 1930s, the fiercely eccentric and brilliant astronomer Fritz Zwicky first stared into the massive Coma cluster and realized, with absolute terror, that the beautifully glowing visible galaxies simply lacked the sufficient gravitational mass required to physically hold themselves tightly together against the violently chaotic spinning forces of the ancient cosmos. Zwicky boldly proposed the highly controversial and deeply horrifying existence of an entirely invisible substance he aggressively dubbed dark matter, a massive, unseen cosmological scaffolding that silently dictates the ultimate structural fate of our entire universe while deliberately evading every single form of rudimentary optical human detection our primitive observatories possessed at the time. Rather than rightfully praising his magnificent visionary genius, the highly arrogant and deeply complacent scientific establishment of the 20th century aggressively mocked his absolutely terrifying conclusions and entirely dismissed his urgent mathematical warnings as nothing more than the completely paranoid ramblings of a deeply unstable and overly imaginative intellectual seeking cheap attention. This deeply tragic historical pattern of intense academic denial perfectly mirrors the exact same paralyzing existential panic currently destroying modern astrophysics as they desperately try to forcefully ignore the apocalyptic James Webb telemetry violently, confirming that this very same invisible dark matter scaffolding is suddenly acting as a highly explosive, universe-destroying primordial fuel. For nearly an entire century, arrogant humanity comfortably convinced itself that the utterly unseen dark gravitational web was merely a fundamentally benevolent architectural feature designed exclusively to keep our highly fragile home galaxy safely and securely bound together, completely insulated from the endlessly freezing darkness and raw destructive radiation of an otherwise entirely lethal cosmic vacuum. The incredibly disturbing revelation that this universally foundational physical anchor is actually highly volatile and purposefully weaponized primordial cosmic kindling violently proves our historically persistent and utterly pathetic psychological refusal to ever willingly accept our own profoundly terrifying and mathematically inescapable cosmological vulnerability when facing the infinite dark abyss. Whenever the relentlessly expanding boundaries of human scientific knowledge brutally uncover a profoundly terrifying physical truth that fundamentally shatters our highly cherished illusions, we historically and consistently choose to blindly attack the horrifying data rather than ever bravely admit that the overarching universe itself is actively and aggressively hostile to our continuous biological survival. Those historically marginalized visionary scientists who desperately and bravely attempted to loudly warn us about the inherently unstable and deeply predatory nature of deep space were forcefully and systematically silenced by a cowardly academic majority, utterly desperate to artificially maintain the highly fragile psychological illusion of a perfectly mathematical and entirely peaceful celestial heaven. Now, as the completely catastrophic and wildly unstoppable dark matter ignition front rapidly accelerates violently across our local supercluster and relentlessly dissolves entire ancient galaxies into absolute pitch-black nothingness, we finally and tragically realize the absolutely horrific existential cost of stubbornly and arrogantly ignoring those desperate, highly urgent warnings from our own scientific past. If the universally foundational dark matter holding our entire physical reality together is fundamentally nothing more than a carefully laid cosmic trap, patiently waiting for an ancient primordial spark, what utterly nightmarish realization will completely destroy our fading sanity when researchers begin exploring the deeply terrifying theory that this is absolutely not the first universe to violently burn to ash. The third and deeply most terrifying hypothesis, formally presented by the most radical cosmological scholars, suggests that this completely unstoppable primordial gravitational behemoth was absolutely never organically born within our current universe at all, but is actually a monstrous, surviving relic deliberately carried over from the incredibly violent, catastrophic death of an entirely previous cosmic iteration. This entirely horrifying theoretical framework definitively resurrects the deeply dreaded concept of a fundamentally cyclical cosmological doom, effectively proposing that reality itself is trapped in an endlessly violent loop of massive expansion and utterly crushing contraction, where apex gravitational predators ruthlessly survive the fiery transition to aggressively hunt within the newly born celestial dimensions. If this rapidly approaching apocalyptic anomaly truly represents the undying remnants of a highly ancient and entirely slaughtered previous reality, it brutally introduces an ultimate existential nightmare, effectively confirming that absolutely nothing our pathetic civilization ever builds or desperately learns will ever matter, because the overarching cosmic stage itself is fundamentally designed for absolute destruction. The deeply suffocating realization violently gripping the terrified scientific community is that our beautifully complex universe was never a permanent monument to miraculous biological evolution, but merely a highly temporary and extremely fragile feeding ground, deliberately cultivated to be entirely swallowed by these completely immortal shadow leviathans that patiently wait in the freezing darkness between creations. This radically devastating paradigm forcefully, completely invalidates the historical sanctity of the primordial Big Bang, brutally reducing our majestic cosmological dawn from a glorious moment of divine genesis into nothing more than a pathetic, localized, explosive reset that successfully provided entirely fresh baryonic sustenance for incredibly ancient entities that completely exist outside the boundaries of normal time. Staring completely helplessly into the deeply corrupted spectroscopic telemetry pouring from the heavily overwhelmed space telescope, the brilliant astrophysics teams desperately try to intellectually process the sheer terrifying magnitude of an aggressive cosmological predator that has successfully survived infinite universal deaths and is completely immune to the absolute destruction of fundamental space-time geometry. Every single magnificent technological advancement and beautifully intricate philosophical ideology humanity could ever theoretically achieve across billions of evolutionary years instantly evaporates into utter meaninglessness when actively forced to confront a completely unstoppable primordial entity that has already meticulously witnessed and violently consumed countless trillions of highly advanced alien civilizations. Our profound human desperation to discover a deeply comforting, overarching cosmic purpose completely shatters under the crushing weight of this infinite cyclical slaughterhouse, definitively proving that universal evolution is not an elegant upward trajectory toward magnificent enlightenment, but simply a completely brutal, endlessly repeating countdown to total physical erasure at the hands of immortal celestial monsters. As this utterly immortal and completely unfathomable cosmic relic rapidly accelerates its highly aggressive geometric expansion across our deeply fragile local supercluster, the absolute most brilliant analytical minds on Earth are finally forced to simply abandon all mathematical hope and quietly accept our entirely unavoidable execution at the merciless hands of a heavily weaponized ghost from a dead universe. If the deeply horrifying truth is that our entire expanding universe is absolutely guaranteed to be aggressively consumed by this ancient relic of a previously murdered reality, what absolutely terrifying mathematical countdown will the James Webb Space Telescope's desperately final telemetry readings violently reveal when they actively calculate the exact arrival time of this gravitational apocalypse at our home world? Operating deep within the absolute frozen vacuum of the second Lagrange point, the majestic James Webb Space Telescope forcefully pushes its degraded golden beryllium mirrors beyond all maximum structural tolerances to continuously stream the desperately terrifying final telemetry readings, actively tracking the rapidly approaching gravitational distortion, currently destroying the fundamental fabric of our cosmos. The ultra-sensitive cryogenic cooling systems, desperately maintaining the mid-infrared instrument at a brutal 7 Kelvin, are beginning to physically fail as the overloaded sensor array captures a terrifyingly precise mathematical model depicting the absolute catastrophic decay of local space-time geometry, aggressively radiating outward from the ancient primordial anomalies' endlessly expanding pitch-black core. Highly encrypted raw data packets, frantically transmitted directly to NASA's primary computational nexus, violently reveal that the horrific rate of spatial degradation is absolutely no longer a distant cosmological event, but rather it is an actively accelerating geometric collapse that mathematically dictates exactly how quickly the surrounding void is being permanently deleted from the universe's physical architecture. The most brilliant orbital dynamicists on Earth rigorously analyze the desperately incoming vector coordinates, only to discover, with completely paralyzing horror, that the leading edge of this entirely unstoppable gravitational tsunami has successfully established a direct, perfectly linear, and mathematically undeniable trajectory, violently aimed straight at the exact galactic coordinates of our highly vulnerable Milky Way. The brutally cold and utterly unfeeling quantum algorithms aggressively calculating the cosmic anomaly's unprecedented mass energy consumption rate definitively demonstrate a terrifyingly exponential velocity profile, mathematically proving that this highly destructive physics-breaking shockwave is violently accelerating its catastrophic approach with every single ancient star system it viciously consumes in the absolute dark. This relentlessly compounding cosmic acceleration effectively traps the entire human race inside a strictly defined and mathematically inescapable apocalyptic countdown to total structural annihilation that simply cannot be negotiated with. Successfully stopped, or even slightly delayed by the absolute most advanced defensive space technologies, our relatively primitive terrestrial civilization could ever theoretically produce. As the profoundly terrifying microscopic gravitational tremors preceding the main cataclysmic event begin to forcefully and physically warp the space telescope's incredibly delicate near-infrared camera, the desperately transmitted final images vividly show the extreme outer edges of our own beloved local supercluster, beginning to violently distort into completely unrecognizable smears of completely shattered ancient light. Continuous massive diagnostic data readouts, aggressively pouring into the entirely silent mission control room, definitively indicate that the rapidly encroaching wall of completely inverted space-time is currently generating localized artificial gravity wells so unimaginably powerful that they are already beginning to violently shred the highly fragile interstellar medium physically connecting us to our nearest galactic neighbors. The completely exhausted and deeply traumatized agency analysts desperately punch the final terrifying geometric variables into their violently overheating supercomputing clusters, horrifically realizing that the historically protective spatial buffer of billions of light years has been entirely consumed, leaving modern humanity staring helplessly down the pitch-black barrel of a highly accelerated and completely certain cosmic execution. With the deeply brutal orbital mathematics absolutely confirming that our ultimate planetary destruction is no longer a distant theoretical possibility, but an incredibly rapidly approaching physical certainty, what entirely unimaginable visual horrors will humanity helplessly witness when the absolute very first destructive gravitational ripples of this monstrous anomaly begin to forcefully tear our beloved solar system completely apart? As the relentlessly advancing shockwave of fundamentally shattered space-time violently crashes against the extreme outer boundaries of the Oort cloud, Countless billions of frozen comets are instantly vaporized into a terrifyingly brilliant wall of superheated plasma that aggressively illuminates the approaching cosmic darkness with a sickening radioactive glow that signals our absolute and utter planetary doom. The incredibly protective magnetic bubble of the heliosphere that has safely shielded our fragile planetary neighborhood from lethal interstellar radiation for over 4 billion years is abruptly and effortlessly punctured by an overwhelming gravitational surge, allowing utterly catastrophic streams of highly charged primordial particles to aggressively flood the inner solar system with unimaginable destructive force. Highly advanced supercomputer simulations, frantically monitoring the localized gravitational decay, graphically demonstrate the horrifying unbinding of the outer gas giants, watching helplessly as Neptune and Uranus are violently ripped entirely away from the sun's stabilizing orbital grip and mercilessly flung directly into the aggressively expanding, pitch-black void of the rapidly approaching cosmological anomaly. Jupiter's massive and historically unyielding gravitational anchor is fundamentally shattered in a mere fraction of a second as the terrifying physics-breaking wave aggressively compresses the colossal gas giant's dense metallic hydrogen core beyond its absolute critical limit, violently igniting a completely unnatural and blindingly bright atmospheric implosion that permanently darkens the surrounding cosmic sector. The terrifyingly precise mathematical geometry of the inner asteroid belt is ruthlessly and aggressively scrambled into a highly lethal, hyper-accelerated debris field that violently bombards the rapidly disintegrating surface of Mars, transforming the red planet into a completely unrecognizable and hyper-volcanic molten wasteland just moments before it is entirely swallowed by the descending spatial darkness forever. Our life-giving sun frantically and desperately attempts to maintain its highly delicate thermonuclear equilibrium against the unimaginably crushing multi-dimensional pressure, but the fundamentally broken gravitational laws aggressively force its brilliant photosphere to violently and forcefully shed massive undulating sheets of highly radioactive stellar plasma directly toward the utterly defenseless orbital path of Earth. As the terrifyingly absolute and entirely unstoppable cosmological erasure forcefully penetrates the highly fragile atmospheric boundaries of our own desperate world, the beautiful silvery moon is abruptly and brutally shattered into millions of jagged, glowing fragments that ruthlessly rain down upon the rapidly boiling oceans in a truly breathtaking display of completely catastrophic and utterly final orbital violence. The profoundly visceral and completely inescapable psychological horror of watching the entire familiar nighttime sky being violently and permanently deleted from the universe's visual registry brings the highly abstract and incredibly dense theoretical physics directly down to a deeply paralyzing, aggressively personal and physically agonizing terrestrial apocalypse that entirely shatters the human collective consciousness. With absolutely no remaining gravitational tethers left to physically anchor our highly vulnerable and rapidly freezing planetary crust to a now extinguished solar system, the deeply traumatized remnants of human civilization are violently thrust completely unmoored into an aggressively expanding, fundamentally starless void that actively seeks to ruthlessly and systematically freeze every single remaining biological cell. As the absolute final terrifying echoes of our violently destroyed solar system silently and unconditionally fade into the incredibly vast and overwhelmingly cold pitch-black cosmological nothingness forever, what deeply horrifying and utterly forgotten terrestrial monuments of our incredibly rich human history will be the absolute last things to tragically and violently crumble into the unfeeling ancient dust of the abyss. Looking back across the incredibly vast and meticulously recorded chronological annals of our fragile terrestrial civilization, violently reveals a deeply arrogant and profoundly naive human species that proudly constructed magnificent monumental stone pyramids and aggressively forged towering steel empires, while entirely and foolishly believing that our cherished historical legacy would miraculously last forever. Every single breathtaking technological advancement and beautifully intricate philosophical ideology painstakingly developed by brilliant historical scholars was fundamentally rooted in the comforting assumption that the incredibly vast surrounding cosmos would remain a permanently stable and peacefully observing backdrop to our continuous and highly triumphant biological evolution across the endless ages. The deeply horrifying and entirely mathematically unavoidable reality violently cascading from the space telescope heavily contrasts this completely pathetic terrestrial arrogance directly against the rapidly encroaching, physics-shattering cosmic erasure that aggressively views our entire billions of years of complex evolutionary history as nothing more than a momentary and completely meaningless spatial glitch. Our most sacred planetary archives and highly protected underground historical vaults, currently containing the absolute greatest artistic masterpieces and most profound scientific discoveries of mankind, are abruptly rendered completely worthless when actively facing a ravenous primordial phenomenon that deliberately utilizes the fundamental fabric of space-time itself to aggressively annihilate structural memory. Exactly like the highly tragic historical burning of the ancient library of Alexandria, but violently scaled up to an absolutely unimaginable cosmological magnitude, the rapidly approaching gravitational shockwave is mercilessly preparing to permanently erase the collective intellectual triumphs of every single brilliant human mind that has ever desperately stared up into the deeply deceiving nighttime stars. The highly revered and deeply cherished mathematical equations, painstakingly carved into academic chalkboards by absolute visionary geniuses like Albert Einstein and Edwin Hubble, will be violently unwritten from the fundamental architecture of the cosmos, as the terrifying gravitational anomaly forcefully aggressively overwrites our localized physics with its own deeply hostile and completely alien thermodynamic laws. Every single desperate and highly bloody historical war, bravely fought by our tragically misguided ancestors over microscopic borders and entirely imaginary resources, fundamentally becomes a profoundly pathetic cosmic joke when mercilessly juxtaposed against an impossibly ancient cosmological predator that is actively swallowing entire galactic superclusters in a single, devastating and physics-breaking orbital breath. When the violently expanding wave of fundamentally shattered space-time finally aggressively penetrates our fragile atmospheric shell, magnificent structures like the Great Wall and the gleaming skyscrapers of our modern megacities will be instantaneously reduced to scattered subatomic dust by the unimaginably crushing multi-dimensional pressure of a rapidly dying and completely unstable localized solar environment. This deeply paralyzing and totally absolute existential dread fundamentally stems from the terrifying realization that our impending physical destruction will incredibly leave absolutely no surviving alien archaeologists to miraculously unearth our buried ruins, because the ravenous anomaly actively ensures the very foundational geometry required to historically record our existence is permanently deleted, as the absolute final and incredibly fragile remnants of our proudly documented human history violently dissolve forever into the relentlessly expanding and fundamentally unfeeling pitch-black cosmic nothingness. What deeply terrifying and utterly inescapable philosophical realizations will ultimately grip our fading global consciousness during those last few agonizing seconds of remaining biological existence? The deeply horrifying and completely unavoidable mathematical truth of our impending absolute cosmic execution violently shatters the profound psychological illusion of human exceptionalism that has foolishly comforted our utterly fragile civilizations for thousands of historically arrogant and blissfully ignorant evolutionary years on this doomed, microscopic blue rock spinning helplessly in the terrifyingly dark void. For over a magnificent century, we arrogantly placed our entire collective intellectual faith in the beautifully elegant equations meticulously crafted by absolute visionaries like Albert Einstein, passionately believing that we had miraculously discovered the eternal hidden language of an ultimately rational and inherently peaceful cosmological machine that fundamentally welcomed our continuous scientific curiosity. Instead of safely navigating a logically structured celestial heaven governed by beautifully predictable thermodynamic rules, we are violently forced to finally accept that humanity has merely been aggressively playing inside a temporary microscopic sanctuary that was deliberately left completely undisturbed until this physics-breaking primordial leviathan inevitably arrived to ruthlessly consume our localized reality. A profoundly suffocating and intensely paralyzing blanket of absolute cosmic loneliness heavily descends upon the entirely defeated global scientific community as they stare blankly at the unyielding James Webb telemetry, permanently realizing that the universe was never fundamentally designed to lovingly harbor biological life, but rather acts as a violently chaotic slaughterhouse dominated by highly aggressive shadows. The utterly deafening silence historically observed, radiating from the billions of ancient star systems surrounding us, is no longer an intriguing existential mystery waiting to be peacefully solved, but is definitively recognized as the deeply horrifying graveyard of countless thousands of completely forgotten, advanced alien civilizations that were brutally and systematically eradicated by this rapidly approaching void. As the highly destructive and fundamentally unstoppable wave of shattered space-time relentlessly accelerates toward our fragile solar system with an absolutely terrifying mathematical precision, every single passionate ideological conflict and desperate political struggle heavily recorded throughout human history is abruptly and violently rendered completely pathetic in the overwhelming face of our imminent erasure. There will be absolutely no miraculous technological salvation, rapidly engineered in hidden underground terrestrial laboratories. And there will be no benevolent extraterrestrial saviors arriving from the deeply freezing cosmic darkness to graciously rescue our entirely doomed planetary population from the incredibly violent and absolutely inescapable unbinding of our localized thermodynamic foundational architecture. We are tragically left entirely alone to helplessly count down the final agonizing days of remaining biological existence, completely paralyzed by the deeply horrifying understanding that the rapidly approaching gravitational shockwave will not just brutally extinguish our fragile physical bodies, but will deliberately and permanently delete the very geometric memory of our entire species from the universal timeline. The magnificent and beautifully brilliant human mind, an incredibly rare and deeply profound evolutionary miracle that once proudly reached out to intimately comprehend the brightest stars, must now quietly surrender itself completely to the violently unyielding and heavily crushing darkness that operates pure apex predator that operates completely outside the fundamentally broken boundaries of human theoretical physics. When the blindingly beautiful light of our completely shattered sun is finally and ruthlessly swallowed forever by the endlessly expanding void, will our absolutely terrifying existential screams simply echo endlessly throughout the permanently dead cosmos? Or are we just the incredibly microscopic first course in an entirely unimaginable universal consumption cycle that is only just now beginning to violently awake?